Thank you, Bob. Bob was supposed to be in Colorado today, so that's why he's dressed the way he is. I feel like I'm way overdressed when I sit next to Bob. It's my pleasure to be here again at First United Methodist Church in Schertz, and I always feel like I have a connection with your pastor. You know, with Jim, I was his sister's pastor. I was Jim's sister, Mary Ann Navy. I was her pastor for 8 years in San Antonio, and with Bob, we both grew up in Iowa. So he grew up on the east side of the state. I grew up in the west side of the state. He grew up in Houston, and I grew up in West Texas. So it's kind of a different thing. It's a pleasure to be here. Mahatma Gandhi once said, "I like your Christ, but I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." It's easy to follow the normal way. It's not as easy to be abnormal. To fall prey to one thing, or to say one thing and do another, to be a hypocrite. It's easy to be happy and still do one thing and say another. It's very natural for us to do this. This week, we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. For the context of this sermon, here's what I found interesting from this event. Barna research company studied the post-9/11 effects on people and their faith. Immediately following the World Trade Center attacks, within the first few weeks, there was an intense surge in religious activity in the United States. And I'm sure you can remember that. I remember on 9/11, I wasn't in San Antonio. I was in Kerrville at Mount Wesley. And I was at a church meeting. And I got up in the morning and we saw, they don't have TVs at Mount Wesley. But we heard what was going on, and we found a TV, and we all watched as the plane actually went into the tower. And I had two prevailing, overwhelming feelings that were going on in my head. Number one, I wanted to go see my family. I wanted to get to my family. And the second thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to get to my church. And I wanted to gather my people together, and I wanted to pray. And that wasn't a unique thing. I think that happened in everyone's life. And I think you probably remember those same feelings in your life. I know my wife wanted to go to the school and get my boys out of school. And just be together. It was one of those interesting kinds of things. The Barna group in their study, in their survey, they saw that religious activity spiked right after 9/11, right after the attacks. It wasn't a unique phenomenon to San Antonio, and this happened all across America. People gathered together to pray, to support one another, and to focus on their faith during a time of crisis. According to the poll, over 50% of the people who were surveyed said that this faith experience helped them during a crisis. Now here's the scary part. The event happened on September 11th, 2001. By October 2001, October, how many days later? 30. That's like 4 weeks, right? America's discipline of gathering together, of studying the Bible, and of praying together, and of supporting each other, which had spiked right after 9/11, had gone down back to pre-attack levels. 30 days after a crisis happened, people reverted back to their old habits. The Barna poll also indicated some very interesting other things that I just find kind of fascinating. One was that Muslim converts after the attacks did not increase. One of Osama bin Laden's goals was to create conversion to Islam by the attacks, and that didn't happen. So he wasn't successful in that goal. The other thing that didn't happen was that the depth of Christian understanding did not increase. It's as if people used Christianity and their Christian faith as a Band-Aid. And when a crisis occurred, they put the Band-Aid on, and when the bleeding stopped and things started to look a little bit better, they took the Band-Aid off and forgot about it. But there's some other things that also changed. Today, in 2021, 48% of Americans have a distrust of Muslims. That's compared to about 60% in 2011. Today, 60% of Americans feel like we will be attacked again. In 2011, 38% felt that we would be attacked again. Now, how does our Christian faith respond to that? I can't but help remember Jesus in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. And remember, after he had stilled the storm, what Jesus did is he turned around to the disciples and he said, "Why are you afraid? Am I not with you?" And that's what our Christian faith tells us. Why are you afraid? Am I not with you? Also, Americans have had a higher concern of the moral condition of the nation. Now, I find that odd because on one hand, we see a general concern about the moral condition of the nation, and on the other hand, we see a continuing decrease in religious activity among Americans. In 1937, 73% of Americans claimed a church affiliation. Today, that percentage stands at 60%. The shocking number is that among millennials, 31% claim no religious affiliation. And the next level down, the Gen Xers, they are at 33% who claim no religious affiliation. Which brings this whole idea to my sermon about being abnormal. It's okay. Christians are becoming more abnormal than we've ever been. And that's okay, especially if you're from Iowa, you kind of know what being abnormal is, don't you, Bob? It's just one of those things. James makes 2 points in the scripture for this morning. The first point is this: all persons are worthy of respect, no matter of their status or financial situation or race or creed. All persons are worthy of respect. A little bit of my personal history. I, for a year, served 5 small churches on the island of Guernsey, which is an island it's between England and France. It's in the English Channel. And I had 5 little Methodist churches. I was in British Methodism and served them for a year. My closest church was a tiny little church that had about 25 members. The name of it was Sion. And I could walk to the church from the manse. And my wife, Sally, and I, we went down to the church. My first sermon was a Sunday evening sermon. And so we went down there Sunday evening, and she took a seat in the sanctuary, and I went back in the back rooms to talk with the stewards. They're the lay people that kind of manage things in the church. And I was getting the order of service together and all of that. So Sally was in the sanctuary. The sanctuary would seat about 300 people. So you have a picture of it in your head, center aisle with pews on about 300 people. She was sitting alone in the sanctuary. And sure enough, a man, I'll never forget his name. His name was John Allez, A-L-L-E-Z, John Allez. He was 90 years old. He comes shuffling down the aisle. He comes down with his cane, comes down the aisle. And Sally saw him, and she kind of turned and she smiled at him, and she kind of expected him to greet her and say, "Welcome to the American," and all that. He goes down, and he stops at her pew, and he turns toward her, and guess what he says? "How did you know that?" But he did. He was a gentleman. He said, "Excuse me, but you're in my seat." And she looked around, and there was nobody else in the whole church. And she was in his seat. And it kind of took me back by, I was kind of offended at first. But then I thought about it, and I began, and in conversations that I had with him later, I came to an understanding. And what I understood is that John Allez had been born into that church. And his parents had taken him to that church every Sunday. And guess what pew he sat in when he was a kid? He was baptized in that church, and his parents raised him in that pew in that church. He got married, and he and his wife sat where? In that pew in that church. And he raised his family where? In that church. That's right. His wife died. His family grew up, and they moved away. And John Allez continued every Sunday to come and sit in that place, in that church. And so I sort of understand a little of that, but I can't help but to think Jesus thinking, or to think, what would Jesus think about if we presumed we had a claim on anything? We become such creatures of habit that even good and right Christian principles, like love your neighbor as yourself and welcome the stranger in your midst, become misplaced because of the habits that we fall into. And when you boil it all down, these habits they become about me. They become about my convenience. They become about my preference. They become about my habits. And they're not bad, but they just interrupt on what we should be doing, what Jesus calls us to do. All persons are worthy of respect. All persons are created in the image of God. And all persons are given gifts for us to appreciate. I've got another story. For 2 years, I was the resident manager in an MHMR facility in Sioux City, Iowa. And I lived, actually the resident manager lived on site. I had an apartment that was on site. I lived with it was a 56-bed facility. So I lived with a large group of intellectually challenged people. And I learned a couple of things about them. Number one, there's a very fine line between mental illness and mental health. Because there were times when you would walk into that facility and you couldn't tell the staff from the residents. It was weird. It was a zoo. And it's just a very fine line. But for the grace of God, there go I. And just really a real appreciation for mental health and a real value for people's mental health. The other thing that I learned is that I got to know these people because I lived there. I got to know the residents, and I realized they were really wonderful people. They all had talents and they all had gifts. They had limits. They had limitations. And they had some freaky, weird stuff going on in their heads. But they also had wonderful talents. And those talents, if you spent the time to sit down and listen to them and to get to know them, you discovered those talents. And I could tell you all kinds of stories about some of the freaky, weird stuff. But they were really neat kind of people. They were worthy. And that's the important thing. James tells us that it's not enough to say that we are the friendliest church in town and then walk by someone we don't know in order to talk to one of our friends and be friendly with one of our friends. We love one another, but we must stretch that love to love the stranger and the persons whom we don't know and those in need. James's first point, all persons are worthy of respect. His second point is this: faith without works is dead. If we have faith, if we have the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen, if we have faith so as to move mountains, if we have faith that God has always had a desire to be in relationship with us and loves us so much that He sent His only begotten Son, that God became incarnate in flesh and lived among us to show us the way, the truth, and the life, if we have faith, but don't put our faith into practice, then faith is dead. Faith is no good. Faith is worthless. I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. It works in marriage. I have faith in my wife. I can believe that I love her and she loves me, but I have to show her that I love her. You know what I'm talking about? I have to act it out. I have to take her out to dinner every once in a while. I have to cook dinner for her once in a while. I have to actually sit down and look at her and listen to her instead of pretending that I'm listening to her when she's telling me about her day. And I have to give her actual feedback on that, and she calls me on that every now and then. I have to live out my love for her. We have to put our faith into action, because faith without works is dead. I remember my mother's faith, not from her theological statements. I remember my mother's faith not from anything that she told me about the essence of God or what the nature of the Holy Spirit is. What I remember is tearing old sheets and rolling them up and putting rubber bands around them and sending them to Dr. Glenn Estruth in the Congo, who ran a hospital in the Congo. That's what I remember about my mother's faith. I remember my mom making a covered dish when a family had experienced a death in their family and taking the covered dish over to the family as an act of love. I remember my mom working the annual church rummage sale, and she would drag me along and tell me that I couldn't touch anything. And I still have nightmares about rummage sales, even to this day, but I remember that with my mom. James says to me, I, by my works, will show you my faith. Albert Schweitzer could have taken a tour of Africa and seen the disease and the poverty and the illness across the land, and he could have thought, I'll go home to my home in Europe, in my comfortable house, and I will pray for these poor people who are dying in Africa. Schweitzer was a man of faith. His father and his maternal grandfather were both preachers. He was a published author. He was a classically trained organist. He was an educated medical doctor. Schweitzer had a lot going for him. He could have been very successful. He could have been very comfortable in his home in Alsace-Lorraine. But he said no. His faith led him to the country of Gabon in Western Africa. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952, and with his award money, Schweitzer built a leprosarium onto his clinic. His faith led him to live out his faith and put it to work. Mother Teresa could have observed all of those people that were dying on the streets of Calcutta who were penniless and poor, and she could have gone back to her cloister, which that's what she was a part of. She could have gone back to the nunnery and the cloister, and she could have prayed for those poor people in Calcutta who were dying. But no, she didn't do that. Instead, she put her faith to work, and she invested her life as a servant and an advocate to the poor. Her faith led her to live live out her life of faith and put it to work. Martin Luther King Jr. could have stayed at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, and tended very well to his flock. He was a good preacher. He was a good pastor. He could have said no, but his faith led him to live out his faith and put it to work. Faith without works is dead. You can be normal like everyone else and allow things to just wash over you and go back to normal and go back to the habits that are comfortable in your life. You can have faith in God, and you can have the assurance that your soul is safe in the right hand of God. But you show me your faith apart from works, and I'll show you my faith by works. I like your Christian, your Christ, but I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. I challenge you today to look in the mirror of your life. Does what you do reflect the image of Christ? Or when you look into that mirror, do you simply see your own reflection? Be different. Be abnormal. Follow Christ and put your faith into works. Amen.